So in my previous video, I went over the future of solo content in World of Warcraft, and more specifically, I went over delves and some of the new systems that pertain to delves. And in part of that video, I went over the upcoming labyrinth system. And in this video, I want it to be much more focused on that labyrinth system, because I've also been thinking a bit more about the possibilities with this system. And I not only think it's going to be much larger than a lot of people think in terms of how many people play it and in terms of how big it's going to be for the game, but there is also a bit of information that I think a lot of people have probably missed around delves in general. So first we should start with a small recap of the delve system. So delves were introduced in the War Within as a new solo or small group piece of content. They're generally much faster than normal dungeons. They are flexible, so you can do them solo, you could do them with up to 5 players, you could do them with all DPS or a normal group of 3 DPS, a healer, and a tank. You get your own delve companion that is seemingly going to be changing with every expansion, that has a bunch of different curios and different effects or abilities that you can unlock for them through doing delves that allow them to just synergize with things you're trying to do, or give you defensives or heals or damage buffs or things like that. And originally you could only choose between DPS or healer, then they later added a tank, and all 3 of those roles are actually able to be used for different setups, especially if you're a solo player playing different roles. Then as we went through War Within, they tried out different systems with every new major update or every new season. My favorite was the final season of the War Within, where we had the ethereal themed new systems, where they added in those portals you could go click on that would give you more loot at the end. Those were actually added as a seemingly permanent feature in Midnight, where now they're just banners you go click on and they'll give you loot at the end, and then they can also give you a buff within the dungeon. Then my favorite thing from the ethereal season that they didn't bring back is you could randomly get the portal that would take you into a separate room that wasn't in that actual delve, that would have a handful of different layouts that could either be a boss or multiple bosses or a bunch of really strong and generally harder to defeat groups of enemies, and all you had to do was clear out this room and then that delve would be over. So you could potentially do a delve significantly faster than you could ever do them. It was essentially supposed to be a skip for that particular delve. Then going into Midnight, we got a new delve companion, the Delver's Journey, that is the renown track essentially for delves every season. I think got much better in Midnight, and we are able to get much higher tier rewards. Specifically, when you get far enough into the Delver's Journey, you can start to just get hero track gear from using your keys on higher level delves, which is a pretty big upgrade because you really couldn't do that in Midnight. So now as a solo player only doing delves or only doing content that gives you delve keys and then doing delves, you can get full sets of hero track gear, and it actually doesn't take a ton of time because keys are generally pretty plentiful, especially since they changed the key system around, made it much more simple, and in general you get more keys than you did in the War Within. And now going into season 2, we are also going to be getting these open world specific enchants for certain pieces of gear like your wrist. There's 12 different enchants you can get on it. Some of them seem quite strong. There's just a bunch of different effects you can try to get on your gear that is disabled if you say go in raids or instance content like dungeons. So these enchants will only be available in delves or open world content that will be disabled everywhere else, which is a pretty interesting way to give solo players or people doing delves or other open world style content bigger power boost that isn't just increasing gear to like the next upgrade track or getting higher item levels. And then there's also going to be what you'd expect, more delves, more variations on old delves, and in general I think delves so far in Midnight have just generally been better. not necessarily in how varied they are or the different activities you're doing in delves, because I think they're kind of just like mini dungeons now with a bit more objectives within them. But I think overall they're quite a bit better than they were in the War Within, especially when it comes to like balancing and stuff, because in War Within there was definitely some pretty wonky balancing early on. But really the main thing I wanted to go over in this video is the new Labyrinth delve system coming in patch 12.1.5, which should be sometime relatively soon after BlizzCon. And unless BlizzCon is already going to be super packed for Warcraft, they will probably do a deep dive on 12.1.5 and the Labyrinth system. Now, I could very much see that at BlizzCon, it's already going to be so packed with stuff, and there's a decent chance we get a bunch of 12.2 revealed to us. So if it's too packed, I could actually see 12.1.5 and specifically the new Labyrinth system actually get revealed to us before BlizzCon. But I do also think that comes down to how big the Labyrinth system is actually going to be. Now, labyrinths were originally revealed with the 2026 roadmap for both World of Warcraft Midnight and some of the classic roadmaps. And we didn't get a ton of information, but some of the stuff we did get about it is quite interesting. We got 2 images, one being like a map mock-up showing what's essentially a delve raid equivalent, and the other one being concept art that showed something that looked quite cool, but looks quite large. And I think that's one of the biggest things, is this looks like a much larger version of normal delves. And they did also give the information that this is going to be a new content type, and the reward structure is also going to be very different from normal delves. So whether that means it's going to be a completely different reward structure, completely separate from normal delves, or if it's just going to be a different way of giving us loot and still maybe connected to normal delves. Maybe you use your keys in here instead of like bountiful delves or something. Maybe it's still part of the Delver's Journey renown. So we're not 100% certain on that. They did say it's kind of the delve version of mega dungeons or inspired by mega dungeons, but I honestly think this is more inspired by raids because of something else they also said going along with the map mockup, because the map mockup looks much more like a actual just raid in the game. It has a bunch of these quite large rooms. Some of them have multiple ways to get to them. It seems like you get to choose where you go next. And they also said that you don't have to do this all in one sitting if you don't want to. You can go do some one day and come back another day and do some more. Now that sounds much more like a raid to me, because even something like mega dungeons where technically you can go in there and do a few bosses and then come back and do a few more bosses the next day, especially when we're talking about the original launch of mega dungeons where they're not yet Mythic Plus dungeons. But usually when you're getting a group for a mega dungeon, you're usually clearing the whole thing or trying to clear the whole thing, and it's not like they're incredibly long compared to like a raid. But if you go and do a raid, unless you're like re-clearing for loot or something, you're probably doing a bunch of attempts and playing for a couple hours and then coming back the next day or the day after or something, and doing that a few times a week. And a lot of progression guilds will take weeks and weeks or months and months to get through the entirety of the raid and the difficulty they're doing it on. So just based upon that, it sounds like these are just going to be delve raids. And it is super nice that these are still going to be soloable and you still have your delve companion in them, so Valera for Midnight. So while there's a lot we don't know about the Labyrinth system, from all the information we have, it just seems like these are going to be essentially solo raids. And I do think there is one other thing pointing to this being a possibility, and this more has to do with the workload of creating what would be delve raids, because that would usually take a lot more work than creating like a mega dungeon delve or something, because raids are one of the most time-consuming pieces of content for the developers to create. And even more specifically, it's usually the actual physical map, the physical arenas you fight the bosses in. Just the physical layout is usually what takes the longest out of a raid. So raids in general take a lot of time to make, but using some very recent information we've gotten from Ian Hazzikostas, we now know that there is a team within the wider World of Warcraft developer teams that is specifically now focused on delves, and that's all their team does.
And so we're really excited to have continued to refine and evolve our approach to making delves. I think, it was a novel format in War Within. Since then, we've established a dedicated delves team that's a cross-disciplinary team that pulls from some quest design, some encounter design, some systems design backgrounds. Because when we made the system for War Within, we didn't necessarily take it as a given that it was going to be an evergreen system that would last forever. If players genuinely hadn't liked it, then we would have said, okay, this was an experiment we tried in War Within. We'll learn from it and go on to do something else. Clearly, it was successful, and it's something that we're really doubling down on and committing to going forward. And so, just learning more about what players like and don't in the experiences, adding more variety, having no more underwater sections, things, just basic learnings like that. But we're always going to continue, as we have with dungeons, as we have with other parts of the game, to evolve and iterate based on a mix of what we're hearing from our players and our own inspiration and creativity.
And that is because the Delve system has been so popular since the War Within and now going into Midnight. It has been such a huge hit of a system that they put a full team just working on Delves. And I'm very curious as to when they actually did this, because it's only been in the last handful of weeks, or maybe the last month, where Ian Hazzikostas did a round of interviews with a bunch of different outlets and content creators where he revealed this information. And this was the first time they've ever said this. We have never been told that the Delve system had its own development team before. So I'm thinking this was something that was a bit more recent, and the Labyrinth system was one of the big things that came out of that. So you have a whole new team working on a very popular new system that they want to change it up and give a much more substantial, more rewarding piece of content for it. Making a Delve raid seems like something that could come out of that. And another reason I think this would be the smarter direction to take these labyrinths is because the World of Warcraft team just makes delves and also dungeons the best in the industry, the best in the genre. Like, you look at raids, you look at dungeons, really aren't any other MMOs that come close. There's not really any other MMOs I played that even come relatively close to dungeons in World of Warcraft. And I think the raids in WoW are still the best in the genre as well. So they're very good at making content like that. And I think the raids in particular, they have been ridiculously consistent with just every expansion pretty much always having banger raids. Even something like Warlords of Draenor or even something like Shadowlands, the raids are generally still always good no matter what else is going on in the game. So you have that much quality and consistency in the raid system while taking developers that have probably worked on that at least somewhat and making a solo version of that for Delves makes complete sense, as it's something the World of Warcraft team in general is already very, very good at. So I'm not really concerned when it comes to the quality of the Labyrinth content itself. I think there's a very low chance that that isn't good. But I think the much bigger question is, how is the reward structure going to be in Labyrinth? Because we know it's going to be different from Delves. And if it's something that's much more substantial, it'll probably be more difficult. Hopefully it's more difficult, or allows you to make it much more difficult than like tier 11 Delves. Then what does that mean for the rewards of the system? Now, you could just say that it's more difficult, you can make it more difficult so you can somehow get myth track out of it. Maybe you could only get myth track from your vault out of it, or maybe you could get myth track out of your vault and using the new reroll tokens to get myth track out of it. But thinking about this more, I actually don't think that's the correct route to go. I don't think getting myth track gear from solo content is actually the best way to go about it. One of the biggest reasons for that is people who focus on other pieces of harder endgame content now probably being forced to do that. Because no matter what happens, at some point there's going to be a trinket or an item with a really good stat weight that, if you could get a mythic version of it, it is going to force all Mythic Plus players, all raiders, to go run that labyrinth and try to reroll token on or try to get that specific myth piece. And that is something I don't think they want with Delves. They kind of specifically weren't making Delves for all of the most hardcore players in the game, so that really wouldn't make sense. And while for someone who only does solo content or doesn't do like higher end dungeons or raids to be able to get myth track gear, for that type of player, I think it would probably be cool to be able to get myth track. I think what would actually be much better is taking what they're doing with these new enchants coming with 12.1, where you are essentially adding more power to solo or small group non-dungeon or raid content that makes your character stronger in a way that's just not giving you higher item level gear. And if you don't know what these are in 12.1, there's going to be an item called a corrosive soul you can obtain through pretty much any like outdoor content. where it will allow you to add a new effect or enchant to certain pieces of gear. And you can only add these corrosive souls to belts or bracers, but they are deactivated in dungeons and raids. So they really are only for open world content and delves, and as an extension of that, also labyrinths. And what's really interesting is these are going to still be in the season when labyrinths are released, because labyrinths are releasing in 12.1.5, these come in 12.1. So you could just get these from doing any of the content that they are enabled in, and you could put them on those slots, and you can get 1 out of 12 different enchants, and there are a bunch of different enchants that do a bunch of different things. You could have a damage proc that has a chance to execute low health enemies. There's ones that poison yourself to get other buffs. There's ones that put dots on enemies. So there are just these 12 different seemingly strong effects that you can put on this gear that is for right now essentially an open world borrowed power system, but this seems like something they may be testing for the labyrinth system in general. So instead of going into labyrinths, this more difficult and more substantial solo delve content, or up to 5 players, instead of going in there and just getting like myth track gear or being able to get myth track gear, instead they still cap you out at hero track gear, but they maybe give gear that's only enabled outside of dungeons and raids that has like much stronger special effects on them, somewhat similar to these corrosive items. So instead of just getting those pair of legs that have normal stats on them, you instead get a pair of legs that have normal stats on them, but they have a special effect on them as well that is quite strong. Because if they do that and make that special effect strong enough, you are essentially in overall power gains getting a myth track piece of gear, but it won't be enabled in dungeons or raids, so those players don't have to go do labyrinths because it's still only hero track gear. But if you're a solo player, you are essentially getting the power of a myth track piece of gear. And they can also, and because of how all of the non-dungeon and raid content generally works, they can make much more crazy effects. Because realistically in Mythic Plus, in raids, and to an extent in PvP, they kind of have to be much more balanced. But if this content is primarily focused on solo players, they could just do some crazy effects. And if it's just overpowered and makes labyrinths too easy for that season, I don't think many people are really going to complain. There's not really any competitive factor when it comes to delves, so there's not really a reason to need to be that super balanced. So they could just do a bunch of crazy effects on this gear, give you a much bigger power increase while not forcing other players from dungeons and raids to have to go and do that content. And it would also allow them to just make more interesting gear. Instead of just giving us myth track that's just higher stats, you now have all these kind of cool crazy effects going on that, like I mentioned, could just be crazy overpowered or break something if you were doing like a raid or a Mythic Plus dungeon. And that could generally be more interesting. But that's pretty much all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.